Welcome to the Premier Interview. My very special guest today was born in Swansea. He was previously the Bishop of Monmouth and Archbishop of Wales. In 2003, he became the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, Metropolitan of the Province of Canterbury and Primate of all England. He's the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Rowan Williams. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
That is an amazing title.
It is rather, isn't it? Yes,
It goes on forever.
I have to have especially large cards printed.
I'm sure you do. Let me take you back to your childhood. What was it like growing up in Wales in the 50s?
My first few years were in a valley village in the Swansea Valley, and I think that's part of the visual memory. The terraces, the river running through, the remains of the mines, because mining was already winding down at that time. Then we were in Cardiff for a bit, rather kind of post-war atmosphere there still, then back to Swansea. And my main memories of Swansea are just what bliss it was growing up 100 yards from the sea. So every day you could be walking by the sea.
A very happy childhood?
Very happy childhood, yes. And Swansea is still, for me, one of the great places in the country.
Probably don't get a chance to go back there very often.
Not enough, I'm afraid.
No. Now, a Presbyterian upbringing, but did I read somewhere that at the age of 11 you made the whole family go down the road to the local high church? Or is that a myth?
No, we moved house when I was 11 and we started going to the nearest chapel. And that was all right for a bit. And then I thought I'd like to see what goes on in that mysterious place called the parish church. And slipped away one morning on my own to go to the parish church.
At 11?
At 11. And came back and said to my parents, well, you know, that's really lively and really interesting. And so we all started going to the parish church. And it was, yes, it was quite a high church in some ways, but the great thing about it was a wonderful pastoral ministry, an amazing vicar who was imaginative and profound and challenging and all the things you want from a priest.
But, I mean, presumably it was a shock to the system, to your family.
I think they were a bit surprised, but they got stuck into it, they enjoyed it.
And as much a shock that your 11-year-old son would suddenly say you wanted to move church?
I suspect that they were already resigned to the fact that I was a rather pious little toad, and that sort of thing might happen.
Did you have any hobbies outside of checking out churches?
Music, mostly, I suppose, all the way through. Singing, very much so. Theatre. Swansea Youth Theatre, back in the 60s.
There's posh. You studied theology at Cambridge and at Oxford. Was that out of a kind of personal conviction of faith, or because it was an interesting subject?
Well, it was both, really. I found the Bible fascinating as a teenager, read as much as I could about it, and about the history of the church. And so, yes, I thought it would be an interesting academic subject, but I wouldn't have done it, I suspect, if I hadn't also been exploring whether I was called to the ministry.
At that stage, you knew then that there was a vague possibility?
I felt there was quite a strong possibility in my teens, but the great seduction that nearly drew me away was that I was absolutely fascinated by English as well, and by drama. And, you know, going into that sort of world as a writer or something like that.
But this call to the priesthood, how did it come about? How did it sort of first start in your life?
I can barely remember when it started, quite early on, I think, and it had to do with that sense of the excitement of worship. And you know, the attraction of being involved in that and being responsible for that. And then I think later on, especially when I was a student, it's sort of embarrassing the way to say it, but finding quite a lot of people seemed to be wanting help and support and getting involved a bit and trying to do that very clumsily and not always successfully, and yet feeling there was a great pressure there to take a kind of pastoral responsibility in God's name and do it properly instead of just doing it in the amateurish way that I was doing. That was a big factor, I think.
And were your friends surprised at this, or did they kind of see it coming as well?
No, they'd always, I think, rather taken it for granted that was where I'd be going.
What about your own deep personal faith? I mean, you were brought up, obviously, as a Christian, and you went off and investigated this church at 11. Was there a point in your life, as there is for some people, where you felt, yeah, this is real, this is personal?
I think there were 2 points in my teens where it really, really came alive. And one of them, interestingly in the light of later developments, was the first time I went to an Eastern Orthodox service and was suddenly utterly overwhelmed by the glory of God and that sense of the abundance of God. And the other was an occasion in a little Congregationalist chapel in Swansea, Peniel Green, listening to somebody, again from Eastern Europe actually, talking about their experiences of persecution in Eastern Europe, and realising that the cost of the cross was being carried by real people here now in our world, and that this man had come through the worst that anyone could do to him, and his faith was real, and somehow that anchored the whole thing for me again.
You met the daughter of a bishop, the lovely Jane, and who you subsequently married. Now, I mean, she's, like you, a fiercely intelligent person, theologian, but you have some great conversations over the cornflakes.
Well, yes, we do talk a lot about theology. The only difficulty is, of course, different working rhythms often mean that at the end of a long day, if I go upstairs to the flat and Jane wants to talk about theology and I really want to watch The Simpsons, and the other way around, but we do talk a lot about it, and I hope learn from each other. And Jane loves teaching and has a wonderful time teaching theology, and is always coming back from that with new questions and new experiences. So yes, it's a marvellous aspect of...
What about your children? I mean, they obviously see you on telly and know that you're quite a famous person. How do they cope with that?
In different ways. I don't think it's been all that easy for our daughter, coming to London as a teenager with all this exposure and public profile. Our son, I think, is a bit more nonchalant at 13 and takes it in his stride very much.
You were consecrated Bishop of Monmouth in 1991, part of the Anglican Church in Wales. Was that a role that you embraced enthusiastically?
It was a bit of a surprise to be elected a bishop back in Wales, because I'd been an academic for a long time. But it came as a tremendously positive invitation. I felt very, very humbled and honoured and delighted to be asked. I sort of wanted vaguely to go back to Wales at some point, and here was a way of doing it.
And the role itself, did it face up to your expectations?
It was wonderful. I don't know that I've ever been happier than as a diocesan bishop. I've never been much of a shot at administration, and there will be people who, kindly or otherwise, will remind you of that fact in the diocese, I'm sure. But the experience of just visiting parishes every week, 2 or 3 parishes every week, and getting to know lay people as well as clergy, and finding at the end of 10 years that the friendships were really, really deep, and that my own awareness of God and what God was doing was so much enlarged by it all. Tremendous gift.
You then became Archbishop of Wales, and then, of course, in 2003 you got the top job, Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, the first Archbishop since the English Reformation to be appointed to this position outside the State Church of England. So what did you bring to the role because of that background, in a sense?
I suppose in Wales it was possible to carve out ways of being a bishop that weren't too prescribed by expectations.
You could do your own thing a bit more.
A little bit. Some of that, I think, perhaps came through. And while I don't want to see the Church of England disestablished, it was very good to be in a disestablished church as a reminder that the real sort of life and energy doesn't depend on the legal structure. And so it gives you a bit of distance, a bit of detachment about that.
I found out recently that in 2001 you came fairly close to death because you were quite near the Twin Towers. You were doing a speech about half an hour before the first plane hit the first tower. What was that like?
It's not quite that hard to talk about, really. We were planning a seminar that morning in one of the buildings belonging to Trinity Church in New York, which is about a block away from the Twin Towers. And we were trapped in the building for a while. I think most of us expected we were going to die. Nobody knew what was happening. And the sound of the first tower coming down was unforgettable. Nobody knew what was happening. We knew that the towers had been attacked. We heard this deafening noise just 100 yards or so away. And yes, we expected we wouldn't get out alive. Eventually we managed to get out through the basement of the building we were in, into this wasteland of devastation outside. And one of the things I remember actually from that morning was there was a creche in the building on the ground floor. So as we got out, we had to bring with us a crowd of tiny children under 4 who were, as you can imagine, completely bewildered and terrified by it all. And that brought it home. It also stopped us worrying about ourselves. And one of the very few positive things I can think of at the end of that day is we did have the news by the end of the day that all the children had been reunited with their families before the end of that day. yes, it was a nightmare.
So where was God then?
Where he always is, always in the centre of things, always in the acts of love and generosity that people give to one another in times of crisis, when you might expect people to be driven inwards by selfishness and fear. So often, amazingly, they have the grace and the gift to turn outwards, and I see God in that. You know, the people reaching out a hand to support, the people just being visibly there. And the wonderful man we met as we tried to escape down the street and had to take refuge for a moment in a porter cabin as the cloud of debris swept past. This man who, we didn't know, a workman, I think, in the porter cabin, just saying, I think we ought to pray. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know that we were all clergy and monks and nuns and bishops and so on, but just took a couple of us by the hand and gathered us round and prayed intensely.
Gosh.
So, a lot of God, and certainly in all the dedicated work done by the rescuers and the fire services and so on.
Yeah, there were some remarkable stories came out.
Remarkable. People expect, when they ask that question, where was God, they expect sometimes an answer in terms of a God who steps in and solves it all, or stops it happening, or mops it up. But the way God works seems to be in the heart of it all and through the people.
You're no stranger to controversy in your time as Archbishop. I mean, let's look at the case of Geoffrey John, who you first of all endorsed as Bishop of Reading, then you backtracked. Do you kind of wish you hadn't done that, with hindsight?
I think I'd have to take the same decision, though it was a profoundly painful one. And I often think the only person who comes out of it with dignity and credit is Geoffrey, who dealt with it all in the most extraordinary way, though the personal cost must have been massive. I thought at first that, given what I knew of his private life being in accord with what the Church required, given the recommendation from the diocese, it would be all right. But perceptions are realities as well, and suddenly perceptions, not only in this country but worldwide, were activated, and I couldn't, after a while, quite see how this appointment was going to be received and welcomed, and how people were going to be able to work with it within the diocese and more widely. And that was a factor, the whole breadth of concern.
He was so very hurt, wasn't he? But as you say, he kind of has moved on, fortunately.
Well, I can't speak for Geoffrey, but I hugely admired and admire how he handled it.
And then, of course, the other big case was the Bishop of...
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, that's the place, thank you. What was the knock-on effect from that? And it's still going on to an extent, isn't it?
I think the real difficulty there was that so many people in the Anglican Church worldwide had said, please don't. You know, this is just going to make life so much more difficult. And in spite of all those please don'ts, it went ahead. I think because people conscientiously felt they should do it. But there are times when I think a bit of restraint and waiting for one another, as the New Testament puts it, doesn't do any harm. And
except if you'd done that for women here, we'd still be waiting.
Slightly different, I think. In the case of women, there was a real process of shared discernment in the Church. Decisions were taken publicly, formally, after a process of thinking. This was different. This was a decision clearly not in accord with where the Church had been and officially still was. And I think the bitterness and difficulty afterwards had a lot to do with the fact that many people around the world said, well, we told you so. We told you it would cause this sort of division and compromises. And that rumbles on, yes.
People love saying that, don't they?
Told you so, yes, yes. And back to what we were talking about earlier, hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Yes, they just I wish we had the gift of it. The Lambeth Conference, a big one, you know, every 10 years it fell in your patch. You're a bit removed from it now. How did you think it went?
Lots of friendships created. That's the most important thing. And I'm struck by the willingness of so many people to stay in touch after the Lambeth Conference. I meet all sorts of people who say, well, I've been in email contact with the other members of my group last week.
That's good. Yeah.
And that goes on. And the two things we hoped would come out of it were people going back to their ministries across the world, feeling they'd been reinforced and resourced for their ministry as bishops. The second thing is people going back with a slightly enhanced sense of confidence in the Anglican Church. I think there was a measure of that.
That's good. A few pluses along the way there.
Pluses.
A few boxes you can tick there. You're often quoted in the broadsheets almost every day, but you made headlines in a big way, didn't you, in the tabloids with your comments on Sharia law. With hindsight, do you wish you'd kind of put that slightly differently?
Hindsight again, isn't it? I've obviously read the text of what I said several times, and I'd still stand by it. I think what it revealed to me was how very, very tempting it is to set up scapegoats and hate figures. And I'm not talking about myself. I think that if I'd been a Muslim in the few days after the Sharia fuss, I'd have felt a bit anxious on some of the things being said in public.
I was thinking of things like what a burqa and all of that. I mean, how do you feel when you see those things in the media? Or do you try not to look at them?
A bit difficult to avoid, really.
Yes, that one was particularly.
Yes. Well, you can't, I think, afford in this sort of job to take all that too personally. You know it's part of a news cycle and a kind of public drama cycle that you're part of for these few days. It'll pass, and at the end of the day, as I've sometimes said, it's not the editor of The Sun I will answer to on Judgment Day.
A very good point, and I'm awfully glad that's the case as well. I guess the Archbishop of Canterbury could be seen as a kind of job for life. Is that how you see it?
It's a job that consumes all that you do for a while. It's not like the papacy, where you go on literally till you die. And I think at the point at which I feel God is calling me not to do it, I stop doing it. But meanwhile,
you press on.
I press on.
Do you think you might see the next Lambeth conference?
I think it'd be quite important to have another presence, another voice, giving a new vision by that stage. But who knows?
Talking of new, we've just had a new person appointed to head up the Evangelical Alliance, not in any way, shape or form comparable to yours, but in some ways trying to unite a diverse group of people. What would your biggest piece of advice be for somebody like that?
I think it would probably be remember that what you say is news, and it's incumbent on you to try and make it as good news as possible. That is, to present it as life-enhancing rather than otherwise.
That's very good advice for all of us, not just for Steve Clifford, of course. Your New Year message this year was... I loved where you quoted St Lawrence about him being arrested and asked to collect all the treasures of the church together, and so he got the orphans and the hungry and the homeless and said, these are the church's treasures. And our hearts shouldn't be focused just on the state of our finances. Obviously, we're going through a credit crunch at the moment. A lot of people are suffering. How do you see that outworking, in a sense, on a day-to-day basis? I mean, it's a lovely idea to have, but the actual workings of it, it's pretty tough out there at the moment.
It's very tough out there. I'm glad that the church has already begun to respond by local pastoral care, by prayers available for people, and by starting to ask those questions. Well, if unemployment really becomes a major issue again in communities, what do we do? What practical assistance do we give? But I think on top of that, we do need to keep on saying, look, this is a time of stripping. It's a tough time. It's a time when the landmarks seem to be shifting. It's very important then that you know where your security most deeply lies, and that we can remind people that their worth doesn't depend on their money and their status. It really does depend on the love of God.
Well, that sounds like a good point to end. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for watching our interview on Premier.tv, and thank you, Archbishop. Great pleasure. Thank you.